I really appreciated that last song, especially. And as I was singing it, I noticed that it didn't really even state who we're placing on the highest place, but it is assumed as we, as followers of Christ, are singing that Jesus Christ is who we are placing on that highest seat, on the highest place possible, and we worship Him. And we worship Him even when we don't understand why some things happen the way they do, when we don't understand how He's working. And a number of things this week probably caused some of us to question a little bit about what is God up to? Why does He do what He does? Why does He allow what He allows? And two things come to my mind that happened this week that really affected me pretty heavily, and probably some of you as well. On Friday, there was a funeral here of a little boy, 1-year-old boy, that just nothing about that seemed to make sense, that a loving, sovereign, powerful God would allow. And as their family was here the day before setting up pictures in the foyer, I walked around looking at those pictures, and I was reminded of when my son was that age and fell and landed on his head and was life-flighted to Fairfax. And, why did God choose to heal my son and not this boy? And I'm pondering that and reflecting on it. And then, of course, on Wednesday, the other event, Charlie Kirk's assassination, that really affected me more than I thought it would. And as I was, I was listening to the news, and we hear he was shot, and then a few hours later, we find out that he had died, and I was surprised at how much that really affected me, because oftentimes, I didn't know Charlie Kirk personally. I'd never met him, didn't know his family. Why would that matter to me so much? And I kind of, as I reflected on that more, I was thinking, is it his political views that affected me so strongly? And I concluded, no, I'm sure it's not that. I guess the things that this man stood for, the godly biblical principles that he stood for, probably line up very closely with what most of us would stand for, and we felt like that was being attacked maybe. And so as we think about these multiple things that happened this week, how do we process a sovereign God in the midst of this? And I think it does us well to think through those and to ponder those. And today's text in Mark 2 is going to kind of, I think, give us some answers to that, because we must come back to that foundational truth that God is sovereign. He is authoritative over all, and He knows what He's doing. And we must trust Him regardless of what happens, regardless of whether we understand or not. And something that the pastor shared at the funeral on Friday was that if we were able to fully understand how God works, then that would make Him a pretty small God, a God that maybe isn't the size that we need God to be. And so we remain steadfast in our faith, in our trusting in that sovereignty and authority of God, even when we don't understand these things that happen in this fallen world. You can turn in your Bibles to Mark 2. We're going to be going from Mark 2, verse 23, through chapter 3, verse 6. I don't really know why somebody decided that the chapter break would happen right where it did there, but so be it. We're going to disregard the chapter break and go and be in both chapters today. So in this text here today, we're going to see Mark continuing his narrative, kind of pushing this whole truth about God. Jesus Christ was in fact the authoritative Son of God. That is, if you remember the way the book is laid out, the first 8 chapters are where Mark is really, really pushing and driving home the truth that Jesus was the Son of God. He had authority, all-encompassing authority. And then from the end of chapter 8 through the end is more Jesus as the suffering Son of God. And so the authoritative King of the kingdom of heaven is Jesus Christ. So if you remember the last couple of verses, the last time we met in the book of Mark, Mark had been bringing out the significance of the difference between the old versus the new, and how we don't put a new piece of cloth into an old garment. We don't pour new wine into old wineskins, and kind of how this new covenant, this new kingdom that Jesus was bringing was very different. And it didn't mesh well with a lot of the thought processes of the Old Testament, the Old Covenant. You couldn't pick and choose and take bits of both and kind of put them together and have it work well. And so Mark had brought that out, and now he carries that thought forward into this teaching on the Sabbath. The way that we view Sabbath in the New Covenant is very different than the way the Old Covenant looked at it. And so he is wanting to bring the heart to it, complete it, bring it to completion so that they could understand this better. And in this text here about Sabbath, we're going to see him, there's another two more conferences starting early on by bringing all these confrontations and seeing how Jesus confronts evil, confronts the narrative of the day, the religion of the day. And so the main adversaries here in this confrontation today are, of course, the Pharisees. These are the ones that we are going to be looking at as the adversary to the principle that Jesus is wanting to teach. Now, I don't know about you, but I grew up in the church hearing these stories all the time, and it kind of created in me this idea that the Pharisees are bad. Okay, I just had this preconceived idea that the Pharisees are the bad guys, because it seems like the gospel writers usually paint a fairly negative picture of the Pharisees because they were always in kind of adversaries to Jesus' teachings. But if we ought to look at how this might have been perceived by the original audience. So when Mark was writing this, people hearing Pharisee would not have necessarily viewed that the same way that maybe you and I do when we think Pharisee. These would have been a middle class group of people. The Sadducees would have been a little bit more elitist and probably wealthy, pushing their agendas down on the lower class. But Pharisees were probably middle class people who just cared deeply about the law of God. They loved the law of God. They studied it deeply. They wanted to figure out how can we protect it from heretics who are going to come in and change it. And so they would guard it with their lives, basically. They cared deeply about the law of God, and they wanted to figure out how it applies into life, right? That's good things. They would take this law of God and say, how does it apply? And so they'd add layers to it. Well, it must mean this, and then in this situation, it would have to be this. And they'd add layer upon layer to the law of God, which ended up unfortunately causing more harm than good, which is kind of what it still happens today when we try and add layer upon layer to what God says. And so that's kind of a little bit of a picture of what this text, kind of the background to it as we lead into the teaching of Jesus that Mark gives us here today. So let's begin. Mark chapter 2, verse 23. It says, one Sabbath he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying to him, look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? So this is a first part. I failed to mention that the way we're going to divide this up, there's two main parts here. The first part is going to talk about how the Sabbath is a time to be blessed, and the second part of it is going to be a Sabbath is a time to be a blessing. Okay, so that's kind of how I perceive this dividing here. But he starts it out here by a Sabbath day. Jesus and his disciples are walking along. They're coming through a grain field. They pluck some heads of grain, probably kind of getting rid of the dust and the stuff that's not good, and then eating the grain. Matthew's version of this states that they were hungry, and so they did this. Now, the Pharisees find fault with this. Pharisees are saying, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? Why are they breaking the law? So we should start by determining were they in fact breaking the law maybe? Were they maybe stealing even? This was not their grain. They were walking along the road. They take grain to eat it. And my first thought would be, well, was this stealing, right? Well, in Deuteronomy 23:25, it speaks to this directly. It says, if you go into your neighbor's standing grain, you may pluck the ears with your hand, but you shall not put a sickle to your neighbor's standing grain. So it was not stealing. It was very, very clear here that this was allowed. And this principle carries forward to today as well. And a lot of cultures would still carry this out. In Haiti, where we lived in Haiti, if you're walking along a path and the owner of that property had a tree that was right along this path, maybe a mango tree or an apple tree or something, you were allowed to pick a piece of fruit and eat it as you walked. You were not allowed to pick it and put it in your bag or your pocket, but you could pick the fruit to eat as you walk. And so this principle has been carried forward even today. So this was not stealing. I want to just start with that. The disciples were not stealing this grain. But were they maybe breaking the Sabbath? Well, it's kind of a little bit hard to determine, but it seems like God's original law would not have indicated that this would have been breaking the law. But the layers that they added to it to help try and figure out what it actually means would have made this breaking the law. So the disciples were breaking the layers that were added to it, but they were not necessarily breaking the original law of God. Because the layered laws is what I'm calling it. I don't know. You can call it what you want. Would have included, well, actually, God's law, the original law about the Sabbath would have included you can't reap grain. Don't go out and harvest your fields on the Sabbath. That was God's law. Because remember, this law was given to a people that were just coming out of slavery in Egypt. All that they knew was 7 days a week, make as many bricks as you can for your masters. That's how your value was determined. And so God had put this law into effect to show them that I put limitations in place for a reason. This is a gift for you. I want you to be able to set aside a day to rest. So you don't have to be producing. You don't have to be reaping your field, like harvesting your fields on this seventh day. This is a gift to you. And so he says, don't harvest your fields on the Sabbath. And there is also restrictions about how far they could walk. But in this, Mark does not tell us how far they walked, so we don't know that. But the layers that they had added to it then, they were trying to figure out, well, then what does reaping mean? So if I start my tractor and do one round around the field, is that reaping? Or if where do we draw the line? We're these people that we want to be able to know exactly, how do I know? Which boxes can I check and which ones can't I? And so they had added this thing, you can't pick any grain. And so they were probably going against the accepted way of doing Sabbath in that day. Now, the question I had, though, I couldn't help but ask was, so why did they do it? The disciples were all Jews, and they would have known that this is not acceptable. They probably saw the Pharisees standing there like this, watching to see, what are they going to do? What are they going to do? And so why wouldn't they have just not? Why not just not reap grain? Why do you have to make this confrontation? We don't want confrontation, right? We don't try to make people mad, or I hope not. I'm actually thinking here that Jesus probably encouraged them to eat it. In Matthew, it says they were hungry, like I said, and so maybe he said, okay, you guys are hungry, you can have some grain, go ahead. And I'm just picturing, one of them, maybe Andrew, says, well, but they're going to be mad, and he's like, go ahead, I want you to eat some grain here. I think Jesus encouraged it because he wanted to make a point. Jesus was very intentional. He didn't just willy-nilly do whatever. He had a short amount of time where he was here to teach what God wanted his people to learn. And so he says, all right, today's lesson is on Sabbath. So go ahead and pick some grain. We're going to make a lesson out of this. I think this was intentional anyway. And so they go ahead and do this. He sees a teaching opportunity here. But was he trying to just do away with all these old laws and start something new? Why would he have wanted this confrontation? In Matthew 5:17, we read Jesus' words, says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." All right? So Jesus is not just, let's just do away with the law, like the Pharisees were probably concerned about. But he's saying, I want to bring the law to completion. I want to fulfill it. I want to bring it to perfection, get the heart of it to the forefront, to the top here, so that you can get what my Father and I actually had in mind when we put this law into place. And so that's, I believe, at the heart of this. This is Jesus being intentional to bring out a point about the Sabbath. So let's keep reading verse 25 here. "And he said to them, 'Have you never read what David did when he was in need and was hungry, he and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar, the high priest, and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and also gave it to those who were with him?'" So, interesting response here. My initial thought was, okay, how does this even apply? We're talking about what we can do on the Sabbath, and now you bring in this thing that David did in the temple. And yet I do believe it does apply. And it's interesting that he uses David, because David would have been a very, very respected man in their circles. They would have looked up to him as kind of their father, the greatest king in all of Israel's history. And so he uses David as the example here, and he wants to bring out this point here. Now, in Leviticus 24, verses 5 through 9, is where we read about this bread of the presence that is talked about here that David ate. And what that was essentially, it was tied very closely to the Sabbath, so I believe it does apply. But the high priests would make this special bread that was supposed to be consecrated for God in worship, and then only the high priest could eat it then on the Sabbath. And it was a little unclear as I read that, but it seemed like they would make it, and then it would sit there all week as a consecration to God, and then they would eat it on the Sabbath, but only the high priest. And so what Jesus is bringing out here is he's saying, you know what? The Sabbath law here, it was meant to be a gift for man's benefit, okay? And so if it is for man's benefit, then if there is a human need that is over here, and the law is over here in contrast to that need, then the human need takes precedent over it. And I would be very slow to say that that is always the case in all of God's laws, because then you could say that, well, I'm in need, and so I will steal to fulfill my need, and that's, of course, not the way it works. And so I'm not going to say that this is the case for all laws, but I think the Sabbath law was kind of unique in the sense that it was specifically given as a gift of blessing from the Father to his children. And, you could argue that all of God's gifts are for our good. Of course they are. And so it's kind of a slippery slope I'm walking on here. But either way, what Jesus is showing here and what we're going to see here in the next verse kind of gives this whole idea credence here. So let's read verse 27, which is actually kind of the central verse of this whole discourse here about the Sabbath. "And he said to them, 'The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath.'" So that was a specific law that was given for the benefit and the pleasure of man. It was just a kind of a smile from God the Father to his children. I want to give you this to show you that I love you and I value you. And so this was a gift from God. And so it does matter if a human need is in contrast to that law. We have lost the heart of it if it adds a load or a burden to man instead of it being that gift of blessing. And so that's what Jesus is wanting to bring out here. He's saying David was hungry. He needed something to eat for his men. So to say that, well, there's bread here that would save their lives, but you can't have it because it's special, it's a Sabbath bread that only the high priest can. No, God's laws are intended for our good. And so when they're in contrast to that, look at the human need that could be met here rather than just going by these layers of laws that we've put on here. But the question we could ask is, did Jesus have the authority to do that? Who is Jesus to say that that's the way it is? Well, in verse 28, Mark answers that. Jesus answered that because these are Jesus' words. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. And so what he's saying here is, Jesus is saying here that me and my Father created this law. We are the giver of this gift to humanity, so we get to say how it gets used, right? So if I give you a gift, I can determine how you use that gift. I can say how I want that gift to be used. And so Jesus did, in fact, have the authority. As the giver of the gift, Jesus had the authority to say how that gift ought to be used. He is Lord even of the Sabbath. And I love the way Mark is just emphasizing here early on in this book the authority and the sovereignty of Jesus Christ. Now, I don't think this verse necessarily needs to be tied just specifically to this. This would possibly have been intended to even apply to this entire discourse that was happening over this section of the book here. Jesus Christ has an all-encompassing authority. Mark wants his followers for all time to be just kind of very, very solid on that. The authority of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. But do we accept that today yet? Do we accept that Jesus is the all-authoritative Son of God and that he is the giver of that gift of Sabbath to man? Now, I think at this time, before we move into chapter 3 here, we ought to look at application for this. What does that actually mean today? What does it mean for us to accept the fact that the Sabbath was a gift from the Father to his children? And so the question I want you to kind of grapple with in your own minds right now and throughout this next week maybe is to ask yourselves a question. What are some needs in my life? What are some real deep personal needs that I have that a well-planned Sabbath would fulfill, would maybe help to solve? Do you have some needs that could be solved if we were to apply a well-planned Sabbath into our week? Now, to help you with that question, I want to remind you of the 4 characteristics of Sabbath that I would have brought out probably about 2 years ago, actually, when I had another sermon on Sabbath. And so those 4 characteristics that I brought out at that point were this. They were stop. Just stop what you're doing. Rest. Delight. And contemplate. Deep, personal communion with God. Reflect on God and his goodness to you. What are some needs in your personal life that a well-planned Sabbath could help kind of fulfill or take care of in your own life? God chose to give us the gift of Sabbath. We can receive it or we can reject it. Let's move on into the second portion of this teaching on Sabbath. The first one, as I mentioned earlier, was that we believe that the Sabbath is a time to be blessed. Now we look at the portion where we see that the Sabbath is actually also a time to be a blessing. What can we learn from this portion? Mark chapter 3, verse 1. Again, he entered the synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand. So this is a different Sabbath, probably, not the same time. It didn't happen immediately after necessarily. Mark is putting them together because they apply. This is the teaching that Mark is wanting us to take here. Remember, this is not necessarily written chronologically. It is thematic. It is topical. Mark had a purpose as to why he ordered it this way. So, verse 1 here, we see Jesus is worshiping on the Sabbath. He goes to the synagogue. He wants to contemplate. He wants to worship. He wants to spend time with God's people. It's a good thing to do on the Sabbath. When we Sabbath, we come together and worship. We're encouraged together. He recognizes that this is a part of the gift, and he wants to exemplify how that looks. Ironically, the main character here in this part becomes a man with a withered hand, and we just talked about God's people being able to pluck and, I don't know what you call that, winnow the grain. This man couldn't have. He had a withered hand. He wasn't able to adequately to accept that gift from God. He had a withered hand, so he was not being able to live fully within the life that God had intended for him. And so it's interesting that that is the actual picture that we get here in this second part. He can't pluck grain. Now, likely some of the people of that day, the Pharisees maybe more than even the others, would have assumed that this man had sinned somehow. That's why he had a withered hand, something he had done to deserve this. We don't see it that way today, thankfully. We often are much more gracious in that regard than they would have been in that day. But that's kind of setting the stage for this portion. Verse 2, and they watched Jesus to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath so that they might accuse him. These guys maybe this is why we have a negative view of the Pharisees, but they seem so uptight and critical, don't they? Like they're standing there, okay, maybe they planted this guy. They went out and found a guy with a withered hand, brought him into the synagogue to see, okay, let's put him there on the front row so that Jesus sees him, and we'll see what he does. That way we can bring some sort of accusations against him. And so, yeah, notice how you have to do this. Just previous to this, they were like, you're not fasting. You need to fast. And you're plucking grain, and you shouldn't pluck grain. And you're doing this, and you shouldn't. You're not doing. Do that. Don't do this. They're so uptight and critical, and you're like, what in the world is with them? Who, I don't know. Did they get out of their bed on the wrong side or what? Is that the thing that happened back in that day too, or not? But is it possible that maybe we can be that way sometimes too? We get so caught up in these, trying to figure out what's right, what's wrong, and we miss the heart of it when we get that way, I believe. Accusing people, always accusing them, all in the name of religion, getting it right. They're not seeking to understand, are they? These Pharisees aren't saying, you know what, help us understand this better. Help us to figure out how can we, we want to help this guy. We're not sure, should we? No, they're just seeking to accuse. They're looking for ways to find fault. Now, it seems like they believe that Jesus can heal him, though. That was the interesting part that struck me. They put him there. They believe that he can heal him. They just want to see if he will. And so on some level, they do see that Jesus is God. But I'm not sure how we reconcile all that. So let's go on to verse 3 now. And he said to the man with the withered hand, come here. Okay, they're like, okay, he's taking the bait. Why would Jesus maybe not have just said, immediately after the service, meet me out behind the gym, and I'll take care of it, but not here. Just once again, he's intentional. He wants them to understand this principle that the Sabbath was here for you. It is for man's good. You're missing the principle behind it. You're missing the heart of it. And he wants them to understand it, and he recognizes that maybe the confrontation is the only way that we're really going to be able to get to the heart of it. So I believe there's probably, I see 3 reasons why he asked the guy to stand up and come up on the stage to have the healing happen. First of all, he wants the man's participation. He is asking the man to stand up, recognize his need, admit his need. I have a withered hand. I need you, Jesus. I need you to heal me so that I can live fully the way you intended for me to live. He needs the man to be willing to participate in this miracle. That is still the way God works today. Secondly, I believe he wants to make it public because he realizes that this will further authenticate his authority and his sovereignty in all of these types of situations. And thirdly, he probably wants to teach that lesson to the Pharisees about human need taking precedent over the Sabbath, upholding all those layers of the Sabbath laws that they had created. Can we fulfill the human needs? And so we're going to see that kind of described a little better in more detail in this next verse, verse 4. And he said to them, "Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill?" But they were silent. Jesus was really, really smart. He was intelligent. He was a great debater. Now, there was no good answer these guys could give, so they were silent. It's a rhetorical question, of course. He knew they wouldn't say, well, Sabbath is better to kill on, or it's better to do harm on the Sabbath. Of course, they couldn't say that. But if they say it's good to do, we should do good and to bring life, now they're enabling or affirming his desire to heal this man on the Sabbath. So there was really nothing they could say to this. They're stuck. No good answer for them. Because they knew that, of course, we are called to do good on the Sabbath. And that brings us to Jesus wanting to bring out this other principle of the Sabbath. It is good to do good on the Sabbath. It's a good day to be a blessing to others, okay? That's this second portion of this teaching. It's good to be a blessing. It's a good time. The Sabbath is a good time to be a blessing to others. And all throughout the rest of the New Testament, we're going to see more teaching about this whole principle, not just on the Sabbath, but like Paul says in Galatians 6:10. So then, as we have opportunity, let us do good to everyone, and especially to those who are of the household of faith. So he's saying, whenever there's opportunity to do good, of course you do it. We do good to each other. We bless each other. We try and help each other. And in our Sunday school this morning, we also, we talked about that. I want to see, was that in chapter 12? Right? It's 12. Love one another with brotherly affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. Don't be slothful in zeal. This whole section is talking about doing good to one another, being a blessing. And then that section is going to end with, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. That's how we overcome the evil, is doing good. That's one of the ways that this can happen. And Jesus wants them to understand it's okay to do this on the Sabbath. As a matter of fact, it's a great day to do that. Do good on the Sabbath. So this would be a good time to be a blessing. Now, what is interesting about the argument that Jesus brings here is there's no middle ground to this either. A lot of times we look at, so they look at something like this, well, it'd be good to do this, but I might get in trouble for it, and so we kind of hang back and say, I'll just wait and see how this plays out. But that's actually the sin of omission. When we know to do good and don't do it, to him it is sin, right? To him that knoweth to do good and doeth it not. And so there is no middle ground here. They tried to take the middle ground, but by taking the middle ground and remaining silent, they're actually doing harm to this man. His hand would stay withered. He's not being healed. He's not able to live fully in what God has intended for him by remaining silent. So by not stepping forward and being that blessing, they're actually sinning. It's the sin of omission. And in John 13, we also read about this. Jesus' very words. He talks about this all the time. He says, you know how the world's going to know that you're my disciples? It's by the way you love each other, by the way you bless each other, do good to each other, help each other. When you see a withered hand, try and heal him. Try and get him to where he needs to be to get healing. And so Jesus is really giving them some really good stuff to process here. We're going to see, how are they going to respond now? Maybe they'll say, you know what, that's right. You're exactly right. What better time to do good? Let's get this guy healed so that God can be honored and glorified. Let's see what happens. Verse 5, and he looked around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart, and said to the man, stretch out your hand. He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. They were not okay with it, but Jesus heals the man. Now, what's interesting here is the part that grieves him the most, he's angry and grieved, right? So angry and sad. His emotions are coming to the front here because he sees his father's, the heart behind this gift that him and his father had wanted to give to God's people, to all mankind, is being rejected, it's being turned around, and it's being used in the opposite way that it was intended from the beginning. And so he's very grieved about this. But the thing that grieves him is their hardness of heart. And God had been talking about hard hearts for many years. Back in Ezekiel 36:26, he says, and God will give you a new heart, and a new spirit I will put within you. I will remove the heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. Jesus was grieved because it was a heart of stone that he saw in these people. And a heart of stone is a hard, unfeeling, and spiritually unresponsive heart, not willing to see the truth of what is being taught here by Jesus. Yeah, we should do good. No, this is what we believe, this is how we see it, and we're not going to move. Not being willing to respond to what God is trying to teach. But that heart of flesh, that soft heart, is tender and sensitive and responsive to the Spirit of God that wants to work within us. And that is the heart that God wants us to have as we look at these principles that he's teaching here. Verse 6, the Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. And so all of this led these hard-hearted people to want to kill him. But what an interesting partnership they're creating here. The Herodians and the Pharisees coming together and conspiring against Jesus. Now, if you ask AI, if you ask Google whether the Herodians and the Pharisees were good buddies or friends or comrades, even AI knows that no, they were not. They had very opposing viewpoints. The Pharisees were very determined to hold on to the laws of their culture and were opposed to the Roman rule. And the Herodians were more sympathetic, political. They were sympathetic to the Herodian dynasty that would have backed the Roman Empire. They wanted things to remain as they were, politically speaking. The Pharisees would have liked to see the Romans overthrown. So they were very against each other. But a lot of times, a common enemy is all it takes to bring two people together. That's a very unhealthy relationship when the only relationship you have with somebody is that you both hate the same person or wanting to take somebody down. So that's a very interesting and unhealthy partnership that is being created here. We're going to get together so that we can take him down. That's all they had in common with each other. And so let's look at some application here on this end as well. So what are some needs? Remember, the first part was we looked at what are some needs that you have that could be met by a well-planned Sabbath. Now think about what are some needs around you that maybe you could meet, that you could help alleviate some pain or need around you that maybe you could use part of a Sabbath to do, or any other day, really, for that matter. But kind of to keep in mind that this gift that God offered his children, the gift of Sabbath, is there some need around you, somebody who's not experiencing that blessing of Sabbath, the blessing that God wants for his people? How can you maybe help them experience that gift as well? So when I've received the gift and I'm basking in the beauty of it, I'm receiving the blessing of it, but I see my brother or sister over here who is not able to be blessed by that, how can I help them receive that gift as well? How can I be a blessing to them so they can also receive their blessing from the Father? That would be the challenge that I would leave you. Now, as you know, we've been doing a one-word challenge for you to take home with you each week so far. This week it was a little more difficult to kind of come up with one word that would kind of apply well to this, but we're going to use the word relax because I think it works from two different angles. And first is just relax a bit, okay? I think that's what Jesus was actually teaching here. Relax. Don't get so uptight and critical and worked up about, he missed whatever. Just relax a bit, okay? But the other angle to it is that's a really key part of Sabbath, I think. Are you able to relax on the Sabbath? God wants that for you. He wants us to not have to be so uptight. We have to make more bricks every day. Remember, that was out of that setting is how God taught them. He really wanted them to understand that the Sabbath is a gift. So it is very, very different than the world's system that they want to push on us. And so will we receive that gift? Are we willing to relax a bit and receive that gift from our Father? Let's pray. Lord, thank you for the gift of Sabbath that you've given us. And then, Lord, you sent your Son to come down and teach us about that gift. And even though it meant confrontation, it meant ultimately that he had to die because it turned people against him. But he was willing to do that, Lord, so that we could understand the heart behind it. And Lord, don't allow us to miss that. We don't want to miss the heart of that gift that you have for us. And help us to figure out ways that we can receive that gift graciously and then help others to receive it as well. And so this week, maybe you're asking us to relax a bit. And it doesn't mean we disregard your laws and become disobedient to your commands. No, we don't relax on that level, Lord, but we maybe need to release some of our tensions and our personal preferences as we receive your gifts. So go with us as we go from here, Lord. I pray that we could receive this gift graciously from your hands. In Jesus' name, amen.